My name is Tim Kawahara, and I am the Executive Director of the Ziman Center. We are excited to welcome today's distinguished speaker, Heather Averick from Affirmed Housing, to discuss Supportive Housing 101. A couple of housekeeping items. Please submit any questions you may have through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, as we will have a Q&A discussion following the presentation. Supportive housing is a highly effective strategy that combines affordable housing with intensive coordinated social services, providing critical, often life-changing assistance to the most vulnerable people in our communities. This includes people with mental illness, drug addiction, disabilities, chronic health conditions, histories of trauma, and other unique challenges. These individuals include seniors, vets, victims of domestic violence, transitional age youth, members of the LGBT+ community, families with children, formerly incarcerated, and many others. And it should be noted that racial minority groups make up a disproportionate share of the homelessness population. Evidence-based research demonstrates that supportive housing effectively helps people maintain stable housing. It also leads to better health outcomes and successfully interrupts the cycle of chronic homelessness. Supportive housing is also cost-effective. People in supportive housing use costly systems like emergency health services less frequently and are less likely to be engaged by law enforcement and face incarceration. It's particularly appropriate that we're having this discussion today as the Greater Los Angeles homeless count is currently being conducted. This evening, the third of three, staff and an army of volunteers will span out across the region to identify every unhoused person in Los Angeles County, including those living in vehicles, tents, parks, creek beds, abandoned buildings, and other out-of-view places. Hundreds of millions of state and federal dollars depend on an accurate count. Last year, I can report that the count was roughly 42,000 in LA City and 70,000 across LA County, which is undoubtedly an undercount. With that background, let me now introduce our distinguished speaker. Heather Averick is Director of Supportive Housing at Affirmed Housing, where she oversees 18 supportive housing communities that are in operation across the state of California. Heather has been instrumental in developing best practices for supportive housing design, facilitating 2 to 3 month lease-ups, which I can tell you is very quick, supporting collaboration amongst on-site housing teams, and creating procedures and protocols to ensure stability of close to 1,000 households. It is my pleasure to introduce Heather Averick. Heather, take it away.
Thanks so much, Tim. Excited to be here today with everyone. Let me go ahead and share a screen here. Okay, perfect. Are we all seeing my screen? I'm going to take that as a yes, or Julie would let me know.
All good.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Looking forward to our discussion today, and my hope is that we'll cover a wide enough array of topics for those who are new to supportive housing and for those of us who maybe have been in the field for quite some time. So with that, we'll dive in. Tim, that was such a very nice welcome for me, so I won't delve onto this intro page too long. But I do just want to mention that Affirmed Housing has 30 years of experience in developing both general, affordable, and supportive housing communities throughout the state of California. Our first supportive housing community opened in San Diego in 2012. And then this year alone, we have 5 new supportive housing communities opening both in Los Angeles and the San Jose area. I also wanted to touch briefly on how I got into this industry, because I know there are some students attending this as well, and I'm such a huge advocate of this work and specifically supportive housing. So I went to law school, and my last year I got to work with homeless youth. That was really eye-opening for me and led me onto a different path than what I maybe initially thought going into law school. And eventually I ended up becoming executive director for a nonprofit that provided legal services to individuals experiencing homelessness, as well as other supportive services. From there, we moved to Boulder, and I was an executive director for an agency there, also working with the same population, and returned to California and was very firm at that point in my mind that housing was the #1 way to impact the lives of the community that I'm most passionate about serving, which is individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So I share that in that it might not be the traditional pathway someone might think of to get into supportive housing, but also I don't think there is a traditional pathway. So my hope is that this inspires some of you to follow in that path and pursue a career in this field because it's so needed. So today we'll cover what is supportive housing, considerations to keep in mind when acquiring a supportive housing site, best practices for design. I'm going to focus specifically on Los Angeles LeaseUps, and then also best practices for once you're in operation, and then we'll end with Q&A. So what is supportive housing? It's commonly called permanent supportive housing, but it is different from general affordable housing in many ways, including who is eligible, how residents can be screened, the on-site support that's available, and then residents' rents are subsidized with vouchers, which is a guarantee of payment, which can be very nice and a change as well from general affordable. And there's also usually vacancy payments covered anywhere from 30 to 90 days. It is based on a nationally recognized housing first model, which pairs housing for formerly homeless individuals with on-site wraparound services. And it also requires a low barrier for entry. So no credit checks, limited criminal background checks, and no sobriety requirements. And as Tim mentioned at the start, it's a proven model. It does work. The on-site services are really robust. It includes case management, food distribution, recovery groups, budgeting classes, life skills classes. In Los Angeles, there's also a devoted mental health provider as well as a substance use disorder provider who are assigned to each community. So it's a robust team that provides the support to ensure that residents retain their housing and are able to change behaviors and really change their lives all within the confines of a safe space to live. All supportive housing residents come through the county's coordinated entry system. The acronym for that is CES. So in LA, CES is managed by LASA, and CES is a system where an assessment is conducted on an individual experiencing homelessness, and then individuals are ranked based on their acuity. So, for example, if someone is chronically homeless and also has a disability and also has a substance use disorder, they would have a higher acuity and be prioritized for available housing over maybe other individuals who are in the coordinated entry system. Also, something that is unique from general affordable is that, as I just mentioned, because we use the coordinated entry system to get residents for supportive housing, there are no wait lists for supportive housing. So we'll move on. Things to consider when you're acquiring a supportive housing site. So first off, you want to think about your ability to manage the community once it's in operation. So things like your ability to fence off the community, place gates so that people who are not residents are wandering in and out all the time, along with the size and footprint of the community. So you'll see in the top slide, this is a community of ours. It has a large riverbed encampment behind this fence on the side, and that's really required us to devote ongoing resources to managing the impacts of that on the existing residents' well-being. So it's these sorts of factors that you want to take into consideration when you're looking at your sites. The development on the bottom is a long, narrow lot, and there was a gap between the back fence where there's an electrical pole. So we had to get creative there on how to secure it so that individuals could not trespass on site. Other things that you want to consider are NIMBY issues, which unfortunately are quite common unless you're developing in a mainly commercial use area or high-rise area. And then also combating those NIMBY issues. For those who aren't familiar, that means not in my backyard. You want to combat that with early outreach, educational meetings to inform the community on the need for this type of housing, who you're housing, and why it's a benefit for all. Also keeping in mind when you're looking at sites, what does the surrounding neighborhood look like? Is there a high gang presence? Is there already a lot of existing encampments in the area? Because these will all be things that you want to take into consideration as you start to look at design and operation in the future. With that leads me to supportive housing design. So in supportive housing, we are housing individuals who are the most vulnerable. They have co-occurring challenges such as mental health or substance use disorders, long periods often of homelessness, and change to behaviors can be very slow, as it is the case for most of us. So you want to prepare for these residents' needs when you're designing the community, with really a focus on resident and staff safety and well-being. So consider design features that can minimize trauma, support mental health of residents, and also consider design features that can help minimize a resident's ability to self-harm if they are experiencing a mental health episode. At Affirmed, we have a supportive housing best practice guideline, which we share with our architects, and then we have meetings, both development team, asset management, and the Department of Supportive Housing team to discuss how those guidelines can be applied to each of our communities. So now we're going to dive into some specific types of best practice guidelines for design. So you'll see in the top slide, that's one of our supportive housing community rooms. We want to include a lot of natural lighting and windows. It's really bright in there, which is a benefit for residents. We also use a lot of natural plants as aesthetic decor. It just makes the space feel warm and welcoming. In addition, you'll see in the picture below that you also want to plan for outdoor community spaces, ideally a designated outdoor smoking area, because as I mentioned, a lot of our residents do have substance use disorders. It's pretty common for a lot of our residents to smoke, and so we want to make sure we're providing them an area where they can do so that isn't necessarily outside the building right in front. Also, you'll see that we, let me go back a slide here actually. So top slide here, we provide furnishings in all of our supportive housing units. And I highly recommend that. While some of our residents coming in might have belongings they're bringing with them, for the most part, we've found that the majority of our supportive housing residents really like that they're coming into a space that feels like home, that already has furnishings provided. Our general standards are that we provide some sort of night table, a dresser, a table with chairs, and then a bed. You also want to take into consideration durable flooring, durable furniture, waterproof flooring when at all possible, especially within the restrooms, and also bed bug deterrent material as well is really beneficial. And then you'll see too on this slide, this is another community room of ours. And again, it's just really bright and airy, a lot of light, natural light, and added light to the space. Another really beneficial best practice that we've implemented is adding a second entrance and or exit to all case management and property management offices. So you'll see I indicated with a little arrow here on the picture on the right. There is a side door there between case management offices. And really this is just for the safety of our staff in the event that an issue were to ever arise, that there is another exit way. Also, making sure to avoid exposed sprinkler heads in units. That's a really, that can just be a draw for residents to hang like clothing off of, which can set it off and unfortunately lead to large floods in units. Also encourage using fob access only for all entrances, offices, elevators, and community spaces. Again, really for the safety of residents and also staff. The reality is, in our supportive housing communities, sometimes external factors become a large play. Individuals come in who are intentionally trying to take advantage of the vulnerable population living there. So anything we can do to help minimize outside traffic coming in is really valuable. Ample lighting on the exterior of the building. I also, we're big advocates of 5-foot minimum interior breezeway hallways, railings, and also 6-foot minimum exterior gates. And then lots of cameras in elevators, hallways, exterior of the building, and stairwells, again, really to support the safety of the residents and the staff. And then also you want to take into mind the unique needs based on the specific resident population you might be housing. So for example, if you're housing formerly homeless individuals who are seniors, you want to make sure you're including grab bars in the tubs, maybe even gravitating towards showers that have benches rather than bathtubs. If it's an integrated community where you have both supportive housing and general affordable housing living together, look at ways that you can minimize noise concerns, whether that's extra insulation. So this could be a whole topic in and of itself, and often is, but for the purposes of today, I'm just kind of touching on the broad overview of our top best practices for supportive housing design. So now we'll dive into supportive housing LeaseUp. So first off, you as the owner, developer, get to select your service provider. So I suggest interviewing your service provider and make sure that their needs and expectations, well, rather your needs and expectations for the community and who you're looking to house there meets the area and expertise of the service provider you're interviewing, especially considering any experience I might have working with a specific population, such as individuals with a serious mental illness or veterans. Some examples of beneficial interview questions would be whether they have any existing case management staff to assign to your community. That way you're ensuring that you aren't getting kind of green case managers only. Do they have any specific staff devoted to working exclusively on LeaseUp? What is their prior experience as the lead service provider at a supportive housing community? And then ensuring that they follow the 1-to-20 on-site staffing ratio, which is the best practice, 1-to-20 ratio being resident to case managers. And then both property management and services will be involved in LeaseUp and working with the referrals that are sent from the coordinated entry system. So here in LA, the Department of Health Services, DHS, will only pull referrals 60 days from temporary certificate of occupancy, TCO, or certificate of occupancy, COO. Whether they use TCO or COO is really going to depend on who the voucher issuing agency is. So for example, HACLA will allow move-ins to take place with TCO. So DHS would pull referrals 60 days from TCO, whereas LACDA vouchers don't allow occupancy until COO. For projects with H funding, DHS pays for the cost of wraparound services and case management, and they also pay the service provider for LeaseUp support for those 60 days prior to TCO COO. That said, I would recommend that for communities where you're going to be housing maybe a harder to find population, so whether that's veterans or even maybe chronically homeless in spas that have a larger number of supportive housing, I would budget for the property to pay for the service provider during lease-up. Because if the service provider can staff up earlier, then DHS will pull referrals 90 days from TCO or CFO. And then also just kind of a cautionary tale is just to really be cognizant of your funding sources and your resident eligibility requirements. The more funding sources and resident eligibility requirements that you have, the longer lease-up timeline you should be anticipating for. So let's get into some of the best practices. First, and I know this isn't possible for necessarily everyone on today, but I highly recommend a developer-led weekly lease-up meeting, and that is going to involve all of your stakeholders. So the invite list can get quite long, but you definitely would want to make sure to include your voucher agency, LASA, because they're going to be overseeing the referrals, DHS, Brilliant Corners, your service provider, property management, the Department of Mental Health, if they're going to be involved, for example, if it's a No Place Like Home project, the VA, if you have a veteran-specific funding source, along with LAHD's accessibility ACHP department, if they're going to be involved. I also recommend putting together a lease-up packet. So for us, that includes a project description, the various funding types, the resident eligibility requirements, the property management documents. I like to include a lease-up flow chart that kind of shows who's doing what and when, a lease-up timeline tracker so everyone's on the same page about timelines and goals and when things need to be completed, along with the roles and responsibilities of service providers and property management team during lease-up. Another best practice is eliminating property management background checks. And the reason why is that the voucher issuing agency is already going to be running a background check that aligns with Housing First principles. So having property management do it as well is really just going to add another layer to the lease-up process and add to lease-up delays. Also, you want to make sure to make asks of the property management team on potential document waivers. Often if you have TCAC funding, there's pretty strict requirements on documents, but there's also sometimes some self-affidavits and waivers that can be allowed. What I have found though is sometimes you have to make that ask to find out that that is a possibility. I also suggest sharing a tracker of the status of all referrals and the pending documents and timelines for paperwork going stale, which again for TCAC is 120 days. I've seen sometimes that there's a disconnect in the communication between property management or the voucher issuing agency on missing documentation that is needed, which can just, again, add to the delays. And so having this tracker really helps streamline that communication between teams. I also recommend working with your service provider to have them collect donations for move-in items. So yes, we're furnishing the units, as I mentioned, but another way to really make that space feel truly like home when a resident first walks in the door is having sheets on the bed and a pillow and having pots and pans and silverware and bath mat and shower curtain and towels and all the things that really make all of our homes feel homey. And I've found that really I haven't found one service provider yet who's been unwilling to kind of work and get donations so that we can make sure all those units are set up before move-in. Also, highly, highly recommend you have LAHD funding to start the process that ACHP has outlined for filling ADA units right at the very beginning to avoid any delays in filling your ADA units. We've also moved to utilizing bed bug canines. So we kind of went through the whole gamut. We started with trying the bed bug zapper, and this is where we've landed on, and it has really been beneficial. It's much easier than using the zapper, pretty cost effective as well. And usually what we'll do is have the canine company come through halfway through being fully leased, and then once we're fully leased. And then I also recommend doing a mock day move-in run-through. This is really helpful for all of the team to know what documents, what paperwork residents will be asked to sign. And then that way services team is also geared up and ready to support a resident for questions that might come up. And then I also recommend creating a release of information for the developer owner, especially if you have a supportive housing department or an asset management team who's going to be involved with LeaseUp, just to ensure that you're able to talk through some of the more in-depth items that might be coming up on LeaseUp. So that leads us to ongoing operations. So first off, we always start with an onboarding training to establish clear guidelines, boundaries, and expectations of all of the housing team, which when I say housing team, to me that means your service provider, the property management agency, sometimes even your security company, and then any other on-site providers that you might have. As I mentioned, in LA, there's a mental health provider assigned. There's also the substance use provider assigned. And the onboarding training, you want to talk through, I'll get into kind of some of the specific documents, but really you want to talk through roles and responsibilities of each agency now that we're open and operating, we have residents living in the community. Also, I highly recommend monthly partnership meetings. So that would include your service provider, your property management company, other service agencies and partners, as well as an owner representative and your security team, because security really is a large part of making sure our residents feel supported and safe. And we want to make sure the security team is aligned with the expectations and needs of the on-site housing team. And then also you'll want to make sure that there are weekly meetings going on to discuss resident concerns, building issues, property issues, and those meetings definitely at a minimum should include property management and supportive service provider team. So now we're getting into kind of some of the more specific documents that we utilize for the onboarding training and ongoing to ensure fluidity and collaboration amongst the team. So the first document is one that outlines the roles and responsibility of property management versus services. It can be a little bit of a blurred line in supportive housing because the property manager is also really involved in working with the residents. So I found that to be helpful to review and sometimes even revisit in terms of what's a property manager responsibility versus a case manager responsibility. At Affirmed, we also utilize a modified version of PATH's 4-step housing retention process. And this is a really good tool for helping support the housing stability of a resident while also encouraging resident behavioral change and ensuring that if there are parts of the house rules or lease that are being violated, that we're all addressing them collaboratively as a team. Also, having monthly town hall meetings is really important in supportive housing, not only for community building, but it's also really good because it shows a cohesive front between services and property management who are a part of those town hall meetings together. We also share a termination of tenancy guidelines with our service providers and property management team, which is really paired with that 4-step housing retention process so that everyone is on the same page of what sorts of behaviors would escalate to an immediate eviction. Because again, the goal of supportive housing is to keep residents housed, to help them gain stability. But there are situations here and there where someone might need to move immediately to eviction. So that termination of tenancy guidelines is a helpful tool for everyone to have. And then we also have a standard operating procedures packet for supportive housing. We modified a version of the Corporation for Supportive Housing's template to put ours together. It's pretty lengthy, but I recommend it because it really is helpful for the team to go back and look at different areas and determine, okay, what should we be doing in this situation? Also, I recommend having a neighborhood advisory group, especially in communities where you experienced a lot of maybe NIMBYism, or if your community is located in more of a residential area versus maybe commercial or high-rise neighborhood. You know, sometimes they're quarterly, sometimes they're monthly, but it's a good opportunity to bring the neighbors in from outside of the specific supportive housing community to talk through successes, what we're doing, and hear any concerns, kind of hopefully address them sooner than later. We also circulate annual surveys to our residents, and we ask questions about how they're feeling about property management, how they're feeling about services, and also their feedback on the property. And what I love about those surveys is it's really a great way to hear directly from the residents regarding what they want, both in a property, maybe things that they want changed as it relates to services, or even staffing. And also it's helped give some really valuable feedback, like in a few of our communities, residents expressed that they wanted vending machines. So that's something that we had put in. But it's a great opportunity for residents to give their feedback, and we have also found it to be helpful to assess any maybe larger property concerns that we can address with property management, and then assess again the next year, has it gotten better? Also really recommend, if your budget allows, to assign a peer support staff. Someone who has lived experience is really valuable for residents to be able to talk with, in addition to case management, along with, you know, a LCSW can be a big benefit, or a psychiatrist. We actually have one of our communities downtown here in LA that has a psychiatrist who was assigned, who's doing his residency through UCLA's med school. And it was kind of a pilot program I think UCLA had started, but it was really beneficial to the residents, and it's something that has led us to now reach out to some of the other medical schools, like in San Diego, for example, where we have communities, to see, can we implement something similar at some of our other supportive housing sites. So I feel like I've done a lot of talking, and now I'd love to open it up for questions. Something else that I'll add is that I'm happy to share some of these documents that I've referenced for anyone who's interested. And I included my email as well in case other questions come up that maybe you don't think of today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heather, for that presentation. Really appreciate it. I guess we have a ton of questions. We probably won't get to them all, but let me, I can start with one of my own. And, you know, we don't have nearly enough supportive housing to meet the demand. And so, you know, what's your sort of process for screening people who get admitted? You know, sort of what's the threshold? I mean, some people are right on the edge, and how do you determine who really needs supportive housing? And then do people eventually cycle out, I guess is my question as well.
So to your first question, Tim, we don't have to do that. As the owners and developers, that's really what coordinated entry system does for us. They're going to determine who is higher acuity, who does have the highest need. And I will say that's a value benefit, because it would be really hard to make that determination, I think. Mm-hmm. And then to your second question, do people cycle out? Yes. We have had some really great success stories. I love this, actually. So one of our communities in San Diego has about 17 general affordable units, and then the rest are supportive housing. So we've had some residents in that building who moved into the general affordable units from one of our other supportive housing communities with a Section 8 voucher. So what was great is that they were coming from one of our other supportive housing communities where they needed that on-site robust team to support them. And then over the years, they were able to work on getting their Section 8 voucher and move into general affordable, and they moved into an affirmed general affordable. So we have definitely heard many stories of that taking place. So yes, people do cycle out. And sometimes residents even end up moving out without a Section 8 voucher. They just, whether they acquire a job and they're able to save and then move out. Whereas some residents, if needed, they can stay and age in place. And that's the case for some as well.
Great. There's a related question from Catherine, sort of on the staff side, but obviously we know these are not, the folks that work there providing direct services are historically not the highest paid people. And it's obviously a very tough job. How do you actually recruit and retain talent on the staff side?
So it's a great question, Catherine. I will say, even just from my background in the nonprofit world, burnout is definitely a real thing, especially I think in this field, because it really is a lot of emotional energy goes into supporting the residents from the on-site staff. That being said, so affirmed contracts are service providers, so we don't have to hire them directly, but we also see something that we track in those annual surveys is what's the on-site staff turnover look like, because that really impacts the stability of the residents. If you have, multiple case managers turning over in a building, residents don't feel like they can trust a new case manager or that they should be invested in that relationship. So the sorts of things that we've encouraged our service providers to do with increased pay, where we're seeing a higher rate of turnover. I know some of our service providers have moved to kind of like a hybrid type model, which is interesting given the kind of the definition of supportive housing. But usually that looks like maybe one case manager will be able to have the option to work from home on the day that other case managers are on site. That seems to be something that helps retain staff. And then, depending on the service provider, they often have also some mental health support, like mental health days even, and that seems to be a benefit as well.
Great. And Jay, who's a friend of the Ziman Center, asked, some neighborhoods oppose your projects in LA because they are very large because of TOC incentives, out of character, quote unquote, with the neighborhood, 6 stories on blocks of 2 to 4 buildings and have short setbacks to prevent the trees from being planted. How do you address those concerns? Neighbors in my area have those specific comments about a project in my neighborhood. Can they build smaller to blend into the neighborhood character?
Yeah, so sometimes we, in our community meetings, do end up making concessions based on the community feedback. So sometimes it looks like, we drop a floor. So instead of maybe it was originally 7 stories, we reduce it to 6 stories or 6 stories to 5 stories. So I think it's balancing both whether the project it can be fiscally operational if you make these changes, like if you're eliminating all of these units that would otherwise be subsidizing and supporting the operations. So I think that's one consideration. But usually we really work hard to try to, meet the community in the middle, so to speak. I know parking sometimes also comes up, and that's something that we've tried to address as much as possible. It's interesting, too, because sometimes we aren't required to provide any parking. And I think that's a hard pill sometimes for the community to swallow. So I think educating, too, on some of the items that residents in the surrounding neighborhood might push back against, educating them as to why this actually will work the way it is. I guess I'll add, though, sometimes you're just never going to make everyone happy, too. And I think that's just something that you have to acknowledge after making, as much changes as you can.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that when you look at an affordable housing development, you can't tell the difference between a market rate and development. Aesthetically, they fit in, and they're beautiful buildings, actually, and built to frequently higher standards than market rate. So, yeah, there's for sure. But, it's not necessarily the building. Frequently, they don't want those people living in our community, right? It's not necessarily the design of the building.
Well, I think, Tim, you just also very much hit the nail on the head of often we hear similar complaints over and over. We're all for this, just not right here. Or we're all for this, but it's just too many right here. And I think the reality is that the design features of a project sometimes come under attack when really the underlying issue is just that, standard NIMBY And so that's where just informing and educating and that ongoing dialogue of why this is a benefit. And, I'm very biased, but affirmed communities are beautiful. They really are. So to say that it's going to deter or take away from any community is just often not the reality.
Yeah, for sure. Jay asked a question: how do you finance your supportive housing projects? Private, public, low-income housing tax credits, others? I would imagine most of it's low-income housing tax credits and LIHTC, and then traditional bank financing.
Yeah, and then, we also apply for, we usually have TCAC, and we have AAA in LA, and we have sometimes No Place Like Home. It varies, but yeah, kind of what you said, Tim, those are like the typical standards. I guess I'll add, right, the more layering of funding that we add that has an eligibility requirement, the more challenging it becomes. So we've definitely been keeping that in mind for our supportive housing communities too. Sometimes it's like a puzzle piece of putting together like what will make the project work, but also making sure that we will have residents to fill the building when it opens.
Mm-hmm. We have a bunch of questions here from Jay. I don't want to monopolize this with Jay's questions, but I'll ask at least one more. And he's asking how your models performed during the eviction moratorium period. I'm not sure that eviction moratoria impacts you or not, but, with the vouchers. But anything with eviction moratoria or during the pandemic, keeping people housed within your buildings?
I guess I'm wondering when you said, how did it impact us? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more. Maybe, Jay, you could type a little bit more in the chat what you mean by that. Obviously, it applied at our communities. And I would say, if anything, again, I'm guessing at what you mean by this, but it actually led to a few challenges for us because, again, as I mentioned, kind of talking through that 4-step housing retention process, there were a couple residents across communities where there were some really high-level concerns going on, behaviors not being addressed, behaviors that were really kind of risky for other residents, and there was, the courts really weren't taking action at all on those things. So for that, it was actually a challenge in that regard.
Great. A couple of questions from Michael, and they're somewhat related, but who are some of the service providers in Southern California? I don't know if you have that built in-house at Affirmed or whether you use outside service providers. And what do those service providers particularly provide?
Right.
Maybe there's people's concern, and there's many others.
Yes. So I guess I'll start with LA, and I'll just talk through, Michael, who we use at our communities. So in LA, we have the People Concern, as Tim just mentioned. We have Homeless Healthcare of Los Angeles. We have PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. And then in San Diego, we have also PATH. We have Father Joe's Village, Interfaith Community Services. So that's kind of in the Southern California region. But what I just listed is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the service providers that work in the field of supportive housing. Just happens to be who we have partnered with. I will say it's been really beneficial to find some of these service providers that we're able to open multiple communities with, because then we already all have an understanding of, what our policies and procedures are and how we work together and what our expectations are of each other. So what they specifically provide, it's a wide array, and it honestly varies from region to region, interestingly enough. So in LA, as I mentioned, the lead service provider, they're in charge of providing the on-site, they call it intensive case management services. So that means that they're meeting, whether it's weekly, daily, depending on a resident needs, with residents to help them through any challenges they might be experiencing, help them work on goals that they outline together with their case manager when they first move in. And then there's also usually a resident services coordinator who is on site to put together activities and groups. Some of them focused just on community building. A lot of them focused on life skills building. Some of the things that I mentioned earlier, like the budgeting classes. And what I love is that the service providers are really good about asking the residents, like, what sorts of groups do you want to see? What are beneficial to you? Some of our veteran communities have different responses to that than maybe some of our other supportive housing communities where there are no veterans. Food distribution is huge. That is a big thing that our service providers often coordinate as well, because food insecurity often goes hand in hand with housing insecurity.
Great. And Julie asked a question about tax credit projects and smoking. This is a very practical question, but designing smoking areas, is that accepted for PSH projects? Obviously it is, but.
Yeah, but it's a little tricky. So what I would say is you still have to meet kind of all the standards. It has to be really far away from the building. So sometimes it's basically impossible to build in a designated smoking area. But then what we do as part of the LeaseUp team is talk through, okay, well, where do we want to encourage residents then who do smoke? Like, where is a safe place for them to go? And what's reasonable? Because I think otherwise what happens is residents smoke in their unit. And that's definitely in violation of house rules in the lease. So there's not always a perfect answer to that. But if you have a large enough space, you usually can designate an area and still be within kind of the requirements for TCAC and non-smoking buildings.
Great. And I had a question just myself about, a lot of homeless people have pets. How do you manage visitors and pets in your buildings?
Visitors and pets. Visitors and pets or residents and pets?
Residents and pets, and then how visitors come in and out of the building.
Okay, so in LA, there's an ordinance that was passed. So in LA, residents are allowed to have pets, which would be, kind of always at all of our communities, emotional support and service dogs or animals are allowed. But in LA, they passed the pet ordinance, so now our residents are also allowed to have pets. But that is not something we've carried over to our Bay Area or San Diego communities. However, I will say that I did kind of talk with our property management teams across LA because I was curious how many of our residents are coming in with pets. And it doesn't seem to be maybe as high of a volume as some people expressed a concern about in the beginning. So far it's been really manageable and has not really caused any issues. I would say more often what is the challenge is what you brought up, Tim, which is residents bringing in their pets and, letting their pets, maybe not picking up after their pets and things like that, or pets getting into scuffles with other residents' service animals. And so the way that we address that is, again, through that housing retention process. We would have a meeting with the residents because all the residents are responsible for their guests, and explaining to them that, if you have a friend coming in who has a pet, you're going to be responsible for that person and their pet. So, ideally what you will do is you'll let the person know they need to come over without their pet. And so sometimes that's an ongoing conversation with the resident because that's the only way you can kind of enforce that.
Sure. Going back to Catherine had a somewhat related question, but what do the security measures look like at a PSH site for some number of security guards, and are they staffed 24 hours, security cameras, technology, et cetera? I think we answered some of those already in that you have fob keys so you can kind of track who's going in and out. I know most of these buildings, they'll have front desks that face towards the elevators so you know sort of who's coming and going. Security cameras, as you mentioned, escape doors, as you mentioned, for social workers. Anything beyond that?
Yeah, so we also have a live monitoring service that we utilize for hours when we might not have an on-site guard. So, at a few of our communities, just based on kind of like what we talked about early on, location. So there's just a higher level of incidences going on because of the outside community. Some of those communities we have 24/7, but it's very few because it's very, very costly and always not effective at catching everything. So for the most part, what it is we use the live monitoring system in tandem with like a foot patrol or a roving guard. And then that's how we kind of manage and curtail any concerns.
Yeah, great. Tyler put in a question. How do you work with tenants who have higher level of care needs than what the property may be able to provide?
Great.
These are very challenging populations to work with, and
Definitely. And I think the reality is that we have a housing crisis, as we all know, in California, and we need, honestly, a variety of types of housing available. So supportive housing is really kind of been the first, and it's so incredible and so needed. With that being said, there are also residents who really are in need of more of like a dependent living type situation, which is not what supportive housing is, but they're being placed in supportive housing because that's all we have. So, to answer that question, often it's really challenging for the onsite team to support those individuals. They try to get them in-home, like IHSS workers who come in and live with them and support them. But sometimes still that's not even enough. And so then it's figuring out, well, where can this individual go? Because again, those higher level dependent living communities, really, there aren't many. So I guess I would say that's maybe a little plug too for we need those as well in tandem with supportive housing.
Yeah, again, another related question. Tim asks, do you ensure property management is trained in housing first, harm reduction, and trauma-informed care?
Yeah, great question, Tim. Yes, and also part of that onboarding training that we go through and that standard operating procedure manual includes a lot of information too, which we go over, right, and we talk through regularly so that property managers really become well-versed in the fact that we are working with populations who often have a lot of trauma, how to speak with our residents to hopefully avoid, triggering any trauma. It's a learning curve, I'd say. Like that's often not the property manager's background, but I'll do the trainings annually because I think everyone can benefit from it. So I think the more that you have those conversations, and the more that in the weekly meetings we bring these things up, I've found a lot of the property managers have made really huge strides in that regard in terms of their knowledge of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from another Tim Soule, who's actually another good friend of the Ziman Center. How do you ensure that you are receiving sufficient services from your county-funded ICMS providers when you don't have a direct contractual relationship with either the county or the ICMS provider?
Oh my gosh, Tim, great question. It can actually be really challenging, which I think was a learning point for us because, in San Diego, services aren't paid for, which I think is a detriment because it really adds to the project cost. That being said, the benefit is that the service providers are contracted with us directly. And as you just pointed out, Tim, in LA, that's not the case. So in situations where we've had challenges, we still have an agreement with the on-site service provider between Affirmed and the provider. But if we encounter challenges or pushback on some of our standards that we would expect at supportive housing, we've either switched service providers or we then loop in, for example, like DHS to help maybe support us in some of the things that we're asking for. But it's a unique challenge. But those are sort of the ways that we work through to try to come to a middle ground on that.
Terrific. And I know you do some of the acquisition and construction management stuff too. A question from Thomas. Would you comment on what you were seeing regarding construction costs? Are there any projects in LA that get built without prevailing wage? Obviously, when you take the subsidies and the LIHTC and what have you, usually, in fact, always a prevailing wage requirement that is union labor. And comments there. I mean, it's true. I mean, the market rate folks are having difficulty with construction costs now too. Fortunately, I think some of the supply chain issues are getting worked out. But comments.
Yeah, so you know what? I'm not the best person to speak to that. While I'm involved with that, I am not overseeing that. We have a VP of construction. We have our development team and project managers that really could speak better to the cost. So I'd be happy to circle back with you and kind of pick their brains if you want to put your email in the chat. But I don't want to speak on their behalf on that regard.
Great. And Thomas, I do know that there are some folks that are doing supportive housing without taking the LIHTC or subsidies. There's some private equity and private models that are being done. You might want to look at a group called SDS Capital, a group called Ethos that is focused on naturally occurring affordable housing, but essentially deploying private sector, private equity models into the space. And if you're interested in that, you can look into some of that as well. In terms of your residents, Heather, do you do mixed populations at all? I mean, do you put families with seniors and singles, and how do you manage that?
We do, and we have a couple of communities that are like that, and actually the majority of our communities in the pipeline are that model. So I think the way that it has worked for us thus far is making sure we're having a lot of town hall meetings to hear about any concerns coming up, maybe from general affordable residents, although maybe from our supportive housing residents as well. And then really making sure that the security team we have is communicating regularly with property management, and that we're addressing anything that might be minor, but we're addressing it right away so that it doesn't kind of spiral. And I bring that up because, for example, No Place Like Home community we have comes to mind, where you have, families living right next door maybe to someone who has had a long period of homelessness. And it's challenging sometimes to co-manage those two populations. I know that the Corporation for Supportive Housing has done a lot of research on that being really a best standard for supporting kind of integration of supportive housing residents into kind of more standard general affordable. I don't know if there's been the reverse research done, to be honest, on like what is the impact on the general affordable. That's something that we've talked about assessing and moving forward in our annual surveys, just to get a better sense of that. So I think that's still something that's a work in progress for us, but we do have communities that are open and operating, and no looming issues that have come up.
Yeah, practical question about how do you manage sort of cannabis and alcohol use in your buildings, and I guess a related question that I would ask is that, a lot of these folks end up cycling out of permanent supportive housing because they simply don't want to follow the rules. They're not used to the rules. And so how do you manage cannabis, alcohol, and, having people follow the rules within your buildings? Structure.
Yeah, so I guess.
Question from Michael.
First, Michael, I'll speak to your question about cannabis and alcohol specifically, because something I always like to bring up in our community outreach meetings is that supportive housing is just like apartments where the rest of us live, where once you're inside the confines of your home, if you're, having a glass of wine at night, or engaging in some other recreational activity, if you're not bothering your neighbors, no one's going to know about it. And you're free and well within your rights to do so. So similarly, that's the case, as I mentioned, with Housing First model. There is no sobriety requirement. So if residents are drinking alcohol in their unit, it's not impacting their behavior that's then impacting other residents. It wouldn't be something that would be addressed or really, to be honest, even known about necessarily. Maybe it's something they'd be working on with their case manager in terms of, reducing those behaviors. But that's kind of on that topic. And then in general, though, how do we enforce rules? That's why we utilize PATH's 4-step housing retention process, is that we understand that behavioral changes are going to take some time. But also we need residents to learn how to follow rules and leases, because eventually, especially if they move out, that will be the expectation. And so that's where we work, the first time a resident has an issue, it's addressed in a meeting with services present, the property management leads that discussion, and then that enables services to follow up and support that resident. And then if the behavior continues, there are subsequent meetings, the level of property management notices escalates. For example, it would become a lease violation, that notice to cure. And if the behavior continued to persist, then that might lead to an eventual eviction. But that would, that's really the onsite team works tirelessly to try to prevent that and help the resident make those behavioral changes.
Great, thank you. I know we're past our allotted time. I mean, there's a ton of questions, so maybe we'll just take 5 more minutes. If you have to obviously go, you're free to go, but we'll try to get a couple more in here. Jeff has a good question. It has taken anywhere from 60 to 250 days or sometimes longer for a new CES match applicant to move into our assisted housing units, as HACLA takes most of the time to process and approve or reject a CES match. This may take even longer when the adult matching agency has difficulty identifying the exact match for designating apartment unit. Is this a common experience for you?
It is. I can tell you that I think there are a large cohort of us working together in LA on kind of some systems and process changes, recommendations for how we can maybe streamline this and make that time shorter. But yes, you are not alone. It can be quite, like the time, in my opinion, I only see it in LA, should not be so long. And so that is something I know that there are discussions going on about, and I don't know if he wants to share his email in the chat, but I'm sure if you want to be a part of that working group, we all welcome you with open arms.
Great. A question from Maura: is there any consideration for offering resident jobs in the property? Security guards, that kind of thing. I know that Step Up on Second does some of that. They have some retail on the bottom floor, and they do convenience shops, and they actually try to do vocational training and get those folks employed inside the building.
Yeah, so that's something, it's interesting you bring that up. It's something that two different communities two different residents have expressed an interest in. And it's something that we talked with property management about, and we ended up landing on it might be a liability at the end, and so it wasn't something they were kind of willing to proceed with. That being said, I think it's a model worth investigating more. Like Tim just said, Step Up on Second does it in their buildings. I think you just have to make sure you have the structures in place, because I could see that getting there could be some conflicts. Worst case scenario, if someone is a resident and then employed on site, and then they're terminated from employment, like what does that look like? Do they retaliate within the building, or do they feel retaliated against in their housing? So that's not something that we're currently doing, but I think looking at Step Up on Second might be a good resource in terms of if that's something you were considering doing.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about design. Thomas had a question about, please share specific architectural considerations you hold as appropriate for supportive housing, which you may not emphasize for affordable, non-supportive multifamily residential housing.
So the biggest one that comes to mind for me is the railing height or open breezeways, because, in general affordable, we have low railings, we have open air breezeways, but for our supportive housing communities, we have found that is just not the model that we want to follow. And so that's really the kind of top one that I'm always fixated on. And really that's just to prevent the worst case scenario. We have I just know of a community in Southern California with a different developer where, unfortunately, a resident did take their life. And I think that's what, anything we can do to try to combat that, we definitely would want to. And so if someone's 100% determined, well, then, there's nothing you can do. But adding railings that are much higher so that people have to really work to climb over them, let's say, for example, that's just something that we found to be unnecessary.
Yeah. And then I guess this will be the last question, but in terms of the actual units themselves, in terms of square footage, how large are these units? And I guess you probably have studios and singles and doubles, and I don't know if you even have triples if you have families, and it goes back to my mixed population question too, but what size units are we talking about here, and what's your mix of singles, doubles, triples?
I would have to go through and pull those numbers for our portfolio. It's not a number I just have in my mind, but we definitely do have studios all the way up to 3 bedrooms for our supportive housing communities, which I guess also includes our rapid rehousing units, I would say. The 3 bedrooms can be a little bit harder to fill depending upon AMIs that are tied to the unit. But, square footage can be anywhere from I want to say 625 to 900 plus. So it's really a range. And again, it really comes down to kind of the footprint of the lot too, sometimes that we're working with.
Great. Well, Heather, thank you so much. We're not we couldn't possibly get to all the questions, so I apologize that if we didn't get to your particular question. Hopefully we will have more of these. We will have more of these in the future, so stay tuned. And thanks for joining us, the audience, as well. These are really important issues, and you know, homelessness is in our face every day in Southern California, and you know, all trying to figure out the special sauce to fix this. And I know the new mayor is working on it as well. So these are all important tools in our toolbox. And I thank Heather for joining us and sharing some of the things that she's seeing on the ground. Look out for future programming. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and have a great weekend coming up as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Tim.